It moved like bait, naked beneath the summer sun, its shadow gliding over the Dnipro river where the air should have been calm. On the Russian side, a MANPADS team could hardly believe their eyes, a perfect target wandering into the kill zone. But the sky is not what it used to be. The battlefield now belongs to those who dare to provoke, to risk everything for a single flash of enemy fire. What seemed reckless was, in truth, a calculated invitation. The hunter had become the lure, and within minutes, a chain of silent signals would turn this act of madness into a masterpiece of precision. Subscribe, and stay with USAI, because behind every explosion lies a decision, behind every decision, a doctrine. And today, you are about to witness how doctrines are rewritten in the smoke of these modern military equipment. The Mi-24 Hind is not a timid aircraft. Its profile is brutally a lie. Twin engines, stub wings, and a nose like a clenched fist. Designed in the Cold War to deliver troops and unleash firepower, it was never meant for subtlety. Yet on this day, subtlety was exactly the weapon. The helicopter drifted over Oleski, a quiet sector of the front where artillery had long fallen silent, and the air was thick with the drone hum of stalemate. There was no reason for a helicopter to be here, unless that reason was hidden beneath the noise of the obvious. Each of its 4 B-8V pods was fully loaded. 28 rockets in every podus, 80 in total. Each rocket measured 80 millimeters across, weighed over 11 kilograms, and carried a warhead of 1 kilogram of shaped explosive, able to pierce 400 millimeters of rolled armor. Enough to shatter a tank column, yet they were being fired into empty fields. To a Russian observer, it looked absurd, like sending an armored knight to chase shadows. The pilot's maneuver was deliberate, a low, wide attack run at barely treetop height. Dust and debris trailed behind as the helicopter released its load in a single, continuous ripple, 80 tongues of fire streaking toward the ground. The roar rolled across the valley, echoing through the shallow river basin. A curtain of smoke and dust spread out, masking everything in a haze of motion and heat. This was not a strike, it was theater. Every rocket impact drew attention. Every explosion invited response. The noise alone was bait for a nervous trigger finger somewhere across the river. To those watching through binoculars, it seemed like a reckless display of bravado, one that begged for punishment. But in modern warfare, appearances deceive. The Mi-24's real mission was not destruction, but revelation. Its rockets painted the landscape with heat, building a map of confusion that only a desperate enemy would try to exploit. Somewhere on the opposite bank, a MANPADS team was about to take the bait. These modern military equipment had turned the ancient art of ambush inside out, no longer hiding from the enemy, but drawing the enemy out of hiding. The Russian team that night were not mythic heroes or unseen wizards of war. They were 2 tired men with a sensible kit and a set of engraved orders. From their vantage in a battered building roughly 3.2 kilometers from the riverbank, the world reduced to a slice in their binoculars, a horizon, a river, and a single machine moving where it ought not to be. Their weapon was the 9K-38 Igla system, compact, crude to look at, but lethal in practice. The launcher and gripstock together weighed about 17.9 kilograms. The missile itself measured roughly 1.5 meters and carried a warhead of about 1.17 kilograms. That warhead packed enough punch to ruin a helicopter's day. What made the Igla truly dangerous was not merely the explosives, but the seeker in its nose. The M39 cooled infrared head. Cooling the seeker crystal reduces sensor noise and extends sensitivity. In plain terms, the sensor can see smaller, colder differences in heat than older, uncooled heads. That advancement means the Igla can discriminate between a bare engine bloom and a simple pyrotechnic distraction in many circumstances. It can lock on to targets moving at hundreds of meters a second. It will track at altitudes and ranges well within the envelope of a low-flying attack helicopter, and it forces a man with binoculars to make a fast, awful choice: fire now, or hesitate and let the aircraft go. Soviet and Russian doctrine is blunt: engage anything within range. The manual insists on immediate reaction to limit the enemy's freedom of maneuver. In practice, that doctrine produces exactly the behavior the Ukrainians wanted to see: a trained operator, checking his parameters, breathing shallow, and then squeezing that trigger when the visual cue looks right. Training narrows the moral calculus. The safe choice for the defending crew is often to shoot. And yet the Igla is not invulnerable. The cooling that grants its sensitivity also shapes its logic. Seekers try to identify a single coherent source of infrared energy and hold on to it. In a field of competing heat blooms, their rule sets may pick the brightest blip or simply lose a solid lock. The Ukrainian plan exploited this limitation without reinventing the wheel. They used heat and confusion as tools. They let the ground burn in a pattern that multiplied thermal signatures so the seeker could not choose reliably. This is the new arithmetic of battle. These modern military equipment do not fight alone. Sensors, signals, and small airborne assets are stitched into a single system that turns a single launch into a signal and then into a target. The human moment of the second a man decides to fire a pater becomes a vulnerability the adversary can and will exploit. The launch was a clean, terrible moment, a thin white flare of ignition and then a black streak cutting the air. For the Russian gunner, it was confirmation of a success. Seeker had found its mark on the Mi-24's engine plume, and the missile motor had burned away. The rocket accelerated fast, closing with the helicopter at roughly Mach 1.9, a bullet of heat and intent slicing through the afternoon haze. Yet the missile was not meeting a helpless target. The Heinz cockpit was a small cathedral of warning lights and blunt instruments. Its crew had trained for this instant. The SBO-15 radar warning receiver is not glamorous to look at, but it is the pilot's sixth sense. Sweeping multiple frequency bands from roughly 0.6 GHz to 17 GHz, it watches for the breadth of radars and seekers. 4 antennas around the airframe give the system true 360-degree coverage and an approximate bearing to the threaten, enough to buy a pilot time, and that time is everything. On the SBO-15, a small bank of 16 LEDs lights up. The kit's threat library recognizes hundreds of emission signatures. It classifies, prioritizes, and sings them to the crew in tones they know by muscle memory. A steady 800 Hz tone means radar lock. A pulsing 1600 Hz announces a missile launch. When the high-pitched pulse started, the crew did not flinch. They had factored this into the choreography. The pilot banked hard, a measured practice rip to the left, and the hind became both dancer and deceiver. In an instant, the UV-26 countermeasures dispenser took over the sky. The system carried almost 200 PPI-26 infrared flares, 192 in total, tiny suns meant to burn hotter than the machine they protected. These flares combust at temperatures that dwarf ordinary fires. To an infrared seeker, they are irresistible and immediate. Now imagine the scene in thermal vision. The ground is a scattering of sudden fires where rockets have struck. Each impact blooms with heat for seconds at a time. Above, a dozen flares ignite in quick succession, bright pinpricks drifting away from the helicopter's engines. The missile's cooled seeker, designed to pick out the subtle contrast of an exhaust plume, is confronted with a three-dimensional storm of competing signatures, a forest of hot points against a similarly glowing ground. Its logic loop, tuned to follow the most coherent, most intense source, begins to cheat. It hesitates, or worse, it chooses incorrectly. That is precisely what the Ukrainians engineered. The ripple of S8 impacts across a 500-meter corridor created secondary thermal blooms. The flares created altitude, separated decoys. The Seeker, sophisticated though it is, found a brighter, nearer heat bloom in the mud and burned vegetation below, and the missile passed harmlessly by. The result looks almost theatrical in the moment, a missile screaming past within visible range, missing by meters rather than striking. What the missile failed to do in that instant was destroy the signal it had just generated. Its launch bloom and the electromagnetic noise from the firing crew were now the enemy's gift, a beacon to be measured, triangulated, and acted upon. In the modern contest of sensors and small platforms, countermeasures and warning receivers are only part of the story. They buy life, yes, but they also feed an adversary's sensor picture. And when those sensors are stitched together quickly, that life is measured in seconds. The missile missed, but in missing, it spoke. Every launch leaves a fingerprint on the white plume of ignition, the spike of infrared intensity, the radio murmur of a team reporting its success. For Ukraine's networked forces, that noise was gold. Within seconds, receivers across the sector picked up the electromagnetic flutter of the launch. Algorithms compared signal strength, bearing, and time delay. 3 points became 1, a triangulated position inside a derelict building near the river. 90 seconds. That was all the system needed. In older wars, the same discovery might have taken a quarter of an hour, maybe half an hour, and then would have crawled through layers of command approval before anything moved. But these forces run on a Silicon Valley tempo. The moment the triangulation finished, a line of code flashed green, and a small map icon turned red. Datsha. Target confirmed. The data leapt across encrypted channels to a waiting drone operator 8 kilometers away. He sat under camouflage netting, headset tight, watching a live map that updated every few seconds. The coordinates appeared in the corner of his screen with a faint tone, a quiet note of confirmation. There was no need for further orders. The network architecture had already authorized the response. The modern chain of command had compressed into a single digital breath. Detect, decide, deliver. This is the true revolution on the battlefield. Speed. The old logic of hierarchy of battalion, brigade, division has given way to trust in the edge, where small teams act as fast as they can think. In this system, signals intelligence is not background noise, but the bloodstream of decision-making. Each sensor, each relay, each human eye becomes a node in an organism that reacts almost instinctively. As the operator prepared his FPV drone, the command servers logged the event. Missile launch at 2:48, triangulation at 2:49 and 30 seconds, confirmation at 2:51, drone armed and ready by 2:52. Less than 5 minutes had passed between bait and counterstroke. The pilot of the MI-24 was already turning for home, his mission complete, yet the consequences of his provocation were only beginning. He had not destroyed anything directly, but he had fed the network. The battlefield was no longer about who pulled the trigger first. It was about who could turn information into action before the other side blinked. These modern military equipment, from infrared sensors to radio direction finders, had made information a weapon in its own right. A single launch, once just a puff of smoke in the distance, now marks the beginning of a countdown. Somewhere on a digital map, a small symbol pulsed, waiting for the drone that would end the story the missile had started. They had 8 minutes on the clock, from the flash of a missile motor to the moment a small rotorcraft would end, a firing team's day. The FPV drone in this operation was unremarkable to the eye. A commercial quadcopter airframe, plastic arms, electric motors. That concealment was the point. A 1.5 kilogram explosive payload sat where a camera gimbal might normally hang. Lightweight, cheap, and easily replaced, this little package had become the final instrument of the trap. The operator sat 8 kilometers downrange beneath a scrim of netting, headset on, hands steady on sticks. His map showed a red cross where the SIGINT had placed the launcher. His feed was a live, first-person view, a narrow window into the target's world. The drone lifted barely 50 meters above the ground, staying low to fly beneath typical ground-based radar horizons. At that altitude, it presents a tiny radar cross-section. Its electric motors produce almost no thermal signature, and only a faint acoustic whine audible within 100 to 200 meters. By the time a defender hears it, it is too late. Crucially, the Ukrainian plan relied on a human failing in the MANPADS employment cycle, the pack-up. A man-portable system like the 9K38 Igla is quick to fire, but much slower to become mobile again. The rocket tube must be disconnected from the gripstock. The spent thermal battery and coolant elements require handling. The launcher is collapsed and stowed, procedures that take between 4 and 6 minutes in plain conditions. In muddy, rain-slick terrain, those minutes become an eternity. Boots slip. Components clog with earth. A team that could sprint off the field on firm ground finds itself fighting the mud and stairs and broken concrete, while the small aircraft in the sky closes the distance. The drone's approach profile was engineered for the moment of maximum vulnerability. It dove from 50 meters, converting altitude into kinetic accuracy, then punched the small warhead into the narrow space between two soldiers and their kit. The first-person camera gave the operator the fine control required to place the explosive precisely where it would do the most damage to men and material. Not to destroy a bunker, but to make a firing team incapable of further operations. There is a human theater to this as well. The defenders are task-fixed. After a launch, their attention is consumed by checks, by disassembly, by the ritual of moving a heavy piece of equipment in desperate terrain. That fixation is the asymmetry the attackers exploited. The quadcopter did not need to outrun small arms or armor. It needed only to arrive before the men could be mobile again. When the blast occurred, it was brief and decisive. One moment, the netted map marker pulsed green. The next, the channel filled with the operator's exultant, quiet breath. Command messages ripple out. Across the sector, radio chatter shifts from confident to cautious. Orders flow down. Do not engage without express permission. The tactical victory is immediate. The strategic effect is slower but deeper. Hesitation blooms where aggression once stood. Cheap, common and distributed, these platforms rewrite risk calculus. The modern fight now accepts vulnerability as a sensor for a wider system. The drone that struck was not exotic. It was ordinary, and that ordinariness made it lethal. What happened that afternoon rippled far beyond a single ruined firing position. The immediate tactical payoff was plain. One less MANPADS team, one less immediate threat to low-level aviation, but the strategic echo was subtler and, in many ways, more important. When an adversary realizes that every launch will be traced, and every signature can be turned into a kill chain, doctrine changes far faster than hardware ever could. First, there is the psychological yield. Units across the sector began to argue on the airwaves, then to hesitate. Conversations that once contained confident direction suddenly added caveats. Do not engage without orders. Confirm by voice. Check your bearings. Hesitation is contagion in a battlefield. It spreads through units and degrades the effectiveness of a defense network built on rapid, local decisions. A network that must pause to verify loses the initiative to attackers who already act at the edge. Second, there is the operational lesson. Pack-up procedures and human ergonomics are part of weapon system design as much as metallurgy. The very steps that make the Igla operable, disassembling tubes, stowing spent batteries, securing coolant elements, equals generate a temporal vulnerability, exploit that predictable human window, and the system's tactical value collapses. Commanders must either redesign procedures for rapid relocation or employ countermeasures that mask emission signatures. Either choice costs time, training, or material. Third, systems integration matters more than platform potency. Here, a dated Cold War launcher was undone by the marriage of SIGINT, rapid decision loops, and a cheap quadcopter. Sensors and shooters stitched together on a fast network transformed a momentary impulse into a decisive outcome. That is a design principle. Lethality is increasingly defined by the speed and resilience of information flows, not merely by the energy of any single munition. Finally, the episode nudges doctrine toward risk acceptance models. Ukrainian crews accepted transient vulnerability to force an outcome impossible by stealth alone. That willingness to accept managed loss for systemic gain will not be universal, and it raises moral and tactical questions commanders must weigh and audiences must understand. The future, then, is hybrid. Old platforms, such as gunships and shoulder-fired missiles, will remain relevant only when rethought as nodes in an information architecture. These tactical fragments will cohere into doctrine if they keep working. The lesson is simple: adapt or yield the sky. The balance of risk and reward has moved. Those who understand the new arithmetic will shape the next campaign. In the brief theater of that river valley, the rules of engagement were quietly rewritten. What began as a reckless-looking gesture ended as an argument about the future of conflict. Who sees first? Who thinks fastest? Who acts with a network behind their finger? It was not brute force that decided the day, it was connection and speed. A small drone guided by a single human eye, fed by sensors and code. If there is a headline for this episode, it is this: the center of gravity in modern skirmishes is no longer only mass and armor. It is the mesh that ties sensors to shooters and human judgment to automatic processes. That mesh is made of radios and receivers, of teams trained to act at the edge, and of everyday devices repurposed into lethal effect. In short, it is made of military equipment, old and new, that work together. There is comfort in the ordinariness of it. The quadcopter that struck was not a bespoke weapon system. Its parts were off the shelf, its logic simple: accept coordinates, fly low, impact precisely. It proves a hard truth: ordinariness, when networked, becomes extraordinary. That is the second lesson. Integrating the commonest tools into a responsive system can outmatch the most sophisticated single item on a shelf. Again, this is about military equipment, not as isolated trophies, but as interoperable components. Finally, there is a political and moral dimension. Accepting deliberate exposure as a tactic forces publics and politicians to weigh casualty risk against strategic outcomes. Commanders must explain why a crew was asked to be visible, and societies must decide what trade-offs they accept in warfare that increasingly depends on speed and small tools. This is not a narrow technical debate, it reshapes doctrine and public consent. So what should you take away? The sky above a front is no longer simply controlled by big platforms. It is contested by a web of signals, eyes, and modest flyers that can be launched from a field or a garage. The decisive factor is not always the most powerful missile, but the fastest decision. In that sense, the future of control will be decided as much by software and networks as by steel. If this analysis raised questions, leave them below. Would you accept a bait-and-kill mission if you were the commander? Why or why not? Subscribe for more breakdowns. The tactics will evolve, and so must our understanding. At 2:47 in the afternoon, a machine built for war broke every rule of survival. A Ukrainian MI-24 helicopter, loaded with rockets, drifted low and slow across a silent sector, an act that no sane pilot would ever attempt.